Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Pereira, the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, and I'm very happy to introduce the panelists today for Ethnoracial Law for Afrodescendants in Contemporary Multiculturalist Ecuador. This is a very important part of the research portfolio of LAC. And I think one perspective to view this topic, which will be very familiar to the anthropologists on the panel, is to see it as part of a larger history of race and ethnicity-based mobilization in Latin America and the Caribbean, mobilization that is often ignored in conventional scholarship. And just to give you an example of that negligence, an otherwise fine piece of scholarship that came out when I was an assistant professor at the New School called Shaping the Political Arena, this brick of a book by Ruth Behrens Collier and David Collier, which is a very interesting account of the incorporation of labor by 20th century political regimes in Latin American Caribbean. If you look for race in the index of this book, which I just did upstairs, you do not find an entry. So it's completely ignored. Another perspective, which would be more familiar to Manuel Gomez on our panel, would be to see this as part of the rights revolution that has been occurring over the last few decades. So the rise of constitutionalism, what some people call juristocracy, or the judicialization of politics. And just to give an example of that, in the country that I work on, in Brazil, there's been a law on the books criminalizing acts of racial discrimination since 1951, the Afonso Arinas law. But there's not really been anything enforceable until the 1989 law, the anti-racism law, and the more recent 2010 statute of racial equality. There was no way to actually bring a claim in the courts under Afonso Arinas. It was just a vague proclamation that this was considered illegal and unconstitutional, but nobody was actually able to get recourse. So our presenter today is Professor Jean Matuba Rahie. He's a professor of anthropology and African diaspora studies at FIU. He served as director of the African and African Diaspora Studies program from 2008 to 2016. He has a PhD in sociology from the Université de Paris, Paris at Nanterre, France. Thanks, Sean. I'm just realizing now that you're not an anthropologist, you're a sociologist, so apologies for that. But
I live my life as an
anthropologically minded sociologist. Okay. We're all into interdisciplinarity in LAC, so that's fine with us. John is currently serving as director of the Observatory of Justice for Afrodescendants in Latin America, OJALA, the very cleverly named OJALA, which has an office in LAC. He's the co-founder of LAC. He's also the editor-in-chief of this journal, Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies, which I recently presented to our donor, Kimberly Green, and she expressed great interest and great admiration in this publication, and that's a link between two of our panelists because the next editor-in-chief is Andrea Quealy. So that remains a very important part of the portfolio in LAC. And John has published a number of books and articles. I'll just mention a few of them. Kings for 3 Days, The Play of Race and Gender in an Afro-Ecuadorian Festival, 2013. Blackness in the Andes, 2014, and a very interesting manuscript that's currently in progress, theorizing the African diaspora in the 21st century from synchronic approaches to diachronic orientations and back. So we have, after Professor Rahie's presentation, we have comments from the two other members of the panel, and first it'll be Andrea Quealy, who we overlapped somewhat, I think. We were both at Tulane in the last year of Andrea's postdoc at the Stone Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies. Now Andrea is an anthropologist of the African diasporic subject formation, focused on racial politics, migration, Blackness as cultural practice. As I said, she's the next editor-in-chief of LACIS. She has a BA from Brown in psychology and Afro-American studies, a PhD from CUNY. She's currently working on an edited volume called Gloria Rolando, Memory Liberation in the African Diaspora Through Cuban Film. And that's expected to come out this year. This year. I know how those projects go. This year or around that time. And our second discussant is Manuel Gomez. And Manuel, you might not be aware of this, but you're a partner with LAC in the joint degree program that we have with the JD and the Masters in Latin American Caribbean Studies. So I just wanted to remind you about that. But Manuel is a great friend of LAC. He's Associate Dean of International and Graduate Studies and an Associate Professor of Law right over there at the College of Law. He's a specialist on litigation, international arbitration, alternative dispute resolution, law and society. He also teaches on international comparative law. And he's done a lot of work on the globalization of the legal profession, institutional reform in Latin America, and innovations in legal education. Manuel has 2 law degrees from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, where I think Claudia has a degree as well in law, and a JSM and a JSD from Stanford University. And I'm not doing justice to any of our participants' bios because they're too extensive and there's too many interesting prizes and publications. But suffice it to say that I'm very pleased that all members of the panel are here. They're very important affiliated faculty to LAC, and without taking up more of the time of the audience, I want to hand it over to Professor Rahier to present his very interesting research. I should mention that the research was funded by a 3-year National Science Foundation fellowship. Probably wouldn't have been awarded had it been reviewed now for consideration. So his timing was impeccable because it was completed in December of 2024. And I congratulate you on that timing, Jean.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. First, I want to begin by thanking Tony Pereira and LAC, Claudia Batista for organizing the event. Of course, my colleagues, Andrea Quili and Manuel Gomez, for accepting to provide some feedback to the presentation today. So, and I thank everyone for coming, obviously. It will be very interesting for me to hear whatever comment you can have on what will be presented. So, it's too bad that there is no, okay, so, okay. So, so the research, the way we're going to proceed, so they gave me 50 minutes. So in 40 minutes maximum, I will present most of the talk, and then we will use 11 minutes to see a part of a video. And so, and then, of course, we will then pass through the comments and the questions and comments from the audience. So here you have, we were awarded the research grant from the NSF in 2021 after the second try. And these are the people who were involved, the team. So Diana is a PhD student in GSS. And all of the other people are based in Ecuador, except him, who is based in France, but now he lives in Costa Rica. So the title, A Multifaceted Examination of the Application of Ethnoracial Law for Afrodescendants in Contemporary Multiculturalist Ecuador, 2021-2024. So how do I have to do it here? Thank you. Okay, so the general introduction here is we'll see that the overarching goal of the project is to examine the application of ethnoracial law in the practice of the Ecuadorian judicial system for the benefit of Afrodescendants. So the term ethnoracial law in our work refers to two categories of legal instruments: the articles and constitution and special laws that recognize and protect collective rights based on ethno-racial identification over territorial and cultural practices. And then another category, which are the articles of constitutions and special laws that are called racial equality laws or anti-discrimination laws. And so, of course, that's what I'm going to explain in a moment, is that these instruments are found in the legal material in Latin America with the turn towards multiculturalism. So, and the advent of what has been called the new Latin American constitutionalism. So we'll see that in a moment. Let me see. So the project had, oh yes, yeah, I have to explain, this is very important, is that the research question, the main research question was not, are these legal instruments useful or working? We know, we knew before we began the research that their usefulness is in fact very limited, and their impact as well. And so what we wanted to do instead was to what is happening to these, first of all, how are these instruments adopted and invented, let's say, negotiated by legislators, and then adopted, and what happens to them once they've been adopted, which is, of course, many scholars have claimed and emphasized the fact that these are instruments that do not work. But nobody really has been taking the time to systematically look at what is happening to them in the judicial system in which they have been, which they have become a part of. So, and this is probably the research, the only research I know of that has engaged in such a systematic examination of the application of ethnoracial law. And now, of course, we are more or less 20 years or more now, 25 years after or more, 35 years after the beginning of the turn. The turn towards multiculturalism begins in late 1980s, and particularly in Brazil with the 1988 constitution. And then, of course, Colombia, 91, and so on. So you have a wave of constitutional reforms and adoption of new constitutions as the turn unfolds. So I don't know what happened. Yeah. So see, these are the four facets. That thing, yeah. These are the four facets of the since we talk about the we talk about the, what did you do? This. No, so then we go back. This side, yeah. So multifaceted, four facets. One facet is to take an examination of the legislative processes and negotiations that led to the adoption of ethnoracial legal instruments in Ecuador since the adoption of the 2008 constitution. In Ecuador, you've had two multiculturalist constitutions, one in 1998 and another one in 2008. The project looks specifically at the universe created by the 2008 constitution. We don't look at the 98 constitution, which became obsolete with the adoption of the 2008 constitution. So I'm going to give you an overview of these four facets without entering into the details of the methodology. I'll share the findings, and then of course, if someone is interested in getting more details about the methodology, we can talk about that later. The second facet is the relative inclusion of these legal instruments in the curriculum of Ecuadorian law schools. So we looked at that as well very carefully. The third facet is the level and quality of knowledge that judicial system operators, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and practicing attorneys have about these ethnoracial legal instruments. And the fourth facet is how have these legal instruments been applied in the practice of the Ecuadorian multiculturalist judicial system, as 13 cases, 13 litigations, which we took as emblematic litigations, more or less half in which the ethnoracial legal instruments in usage was about the collective rights, and the other half is about anti-discrimination law. You remember we are dealing with two categories of ethnoracial law. So then I'm going to go very quickly about that. We locate the research in the literature, race and the law. Of course, that's there is a body of work there. Laws in the book versus laws in action, and we are, of course, on the side of mostly locate on the side of laws in action. Towards a new anthropology of the multicultural state. So there is this movement in social sciences in Latin America, but also in Europe, Latin Americanist, but based in Europe, on engaging in a new anthropology of the multicultural state. The new anthropology is inspired by the work of Akhil Gupta and others who were very active in the 90s and who are associated with what has been called the anthropology of the state. So, okay, so this is just to tell you, so we shouldn't spend too much time. So the first facet is very much it's about these instruments, and we have worked there on in a particular way. So we identified 70 instruments in total. Either they are provincial instruments, municipal instruments, but most importantly, national laws or the constitutions. And so we, out of these 70, decided to focus exclusively on 20, which we considered for a number of reasons as most important. And so these are the 20 instruments. They are here listed in Spanish, and you can see the second slide about that is here. So these are the instruments that we looked at. We, for these instruments, have been collecting archives in legislatures, particularly in the National Assembly. You have to know that when a law is, for a law to be passed, it has to go through work in commission. This leaves archives. And then the law must go through 2 debates in the National Assembly, and each debate, of course, obviously leaves archives. So we worked on these archives. And we also interviewed the political actors who were involved in the negotiations that led to the adoption. So we collected a lot of data, and we can say that, in fact, these instruments, these negotiations and the work that the Assembly and the legislators did was, in fact, marked by a fantastic utopian enthusiasm. Anyone who has worked on the constitutional assemblies in Latin America, I've worked in the 2008 Constitutional Assembly in Ecuador, in Montecristi. These are moments of utopian effervescence. The assembleístas think that they are redoing everything, and they have views. Obviously, this is a characteristic of the new constitutionalism, is that unlike the Republican constitutionalism that preceded it, the utopia is in fact expressed by the adoption of these instruments that are supposed to lead to a better society, and that doesn't exist yet. So it's not, it's a contrary, it's a transformist and utopian, you know, the new constitutionalism. And so, of course, that's the same thing. This is what we find, of course, in Ecuador. So yes, so I'm going to go fast because so that's what I just say. I won't say much more on that. Now, so what we can say is that all of the actors that were involved in the adoption of these instruments are extremely frustrated now for realizing that their utopian hopes have not been met. And so we have interviewed them, those who were involved in and they, particularly, you know, the leaders of Afro-descendant social movements, and they are very, very, who were also involved in the political negotiations, and they're very disappointed by the lack of progress that followed this adoption. So the second facet, the relative inclusion, the inclusion of these, so this is, I'm trying to go fast with that, is that this is, in Ecuador, you have 41 recognized law schools. And we revised the curriculum of all law schools. And of these 41 law schools, only 17, in fact, have in their curriculum courses about these ethnoracial legal instruments. So I could share more about how we went to measure that. But of those, usually most of them don't have any course. And then, of course, those, when there is a course, is one course or two, the majority of them. And then there is an exception here, which is la Universidad Amauta-Huasi, which is an indigenous university created by a law passed during Rafael Correa's presidency in 2004, and which came in existence a little later, and which has, unlike the other ones, 30 courses in the curriculum. That it doesn't mean that all the students have to take the 30 courses, but there are 30 courses offered that cover this. So this is some sort of a major aberration. So these courses, these courses tend to, in fact, focus mostly on collective rights, much more so than on anti-discrimination. This is very interesting. And this is what leads us in the analysis of the data we have collected to that allows us, in addition to what we've observed in the negotiation and the creation of these instruments, the negotiation, the adoption, the votes, is the primacy, la primacía of lo indígena in the field of alterity in Ecuador. So the prime alterity, ethno-racial alterity in Ecuador, in the Andean region, and in many other countries of Latin America, is first and foremost indigena. And in fact, Afro-descendants, when they are trying to verbalize and formulate their demands, they must, in fact, use and learn to use a language of contention that has been devised thinking primarily about indigenous people. And so, and they need to, in fact, insert themselves and sometimes parade as quasi-indigenous in order to obtain certain rights, particularly collective rights. Okay, so we did a focus group with students. We did interviews of many law professors, law students, and some law students, and particularly Afro-descendant law students, which we of course worked with as well, were complaining about the fact that there was in his university a young man who was explaining that there was a course called Derecho y Diversidad Cultural. And it was an indigenous professor, And he basically talked exclusively about indigenous realities and indigenous cultures. And so, of course, the student said, but I thought it was diversity, cultural diversity. And obviously, he said, oh, no, for me, cultural diversity is indigenous. So that's there is a number of illustrations of that primacy, the primacy of lo indígena in the field of alterity. So yeah, it was, we tried to organize a focus group with law professors. We couldn't do it. They didn't want to participate and reveal that they didn't know, in fact, a great lot about ethno-racial legal instruments. So although the students had no problem saying we don't know because they don't teach it to us, the professors had a problem declaring eventually in front of colleagues that that they didn't have the knowledge that that one would expect them to have. So the third facet, yes. So this is the most. There is a lot of information here because, of course, it was a big challenge for us to reach the los operadores, the operators of the justice system, of the judicial system. How are we going to reach them? So to make a long story short, the only way we could do that was to offer to the school associated with each professional line of operators. There is a school for prosecutors, a school for judges, and a school for public defenders. And we offered them, so I requested from the NSF grant officer who agreed, and they gave me additional money to organize a workshop for each one of these schools with professionals that we hired, that we were able to pay to provide a workshop on ethno-racial law in Ecuador. Okay, so and then of course each workshop was a 4-day workshop, and we began the workshop with circulating our survey. And that's how we presented it, in fact, as some sort of a way for us to see where they were with their knowledge about ethno-racial law. And this is how we received more than 1,300 responses to our survey, which was fantastic. And we were expecting, when we designed the project, to have, if we get 500, that would be fantastic. And here we got so. And let me share with you the. We're going to go quickly, but so of the 1,300, we had to eliminate a few that were incomplete and so on. So we mostly worked with the 1166. And so of these 1166, some were still incomplete, but we didn't eliminate all of the incompletes. We eliminated the incompletes that had to be incompleted because we could not extract any meaning out of them. But the other ones, we kept them. So, so this is a very a good number. And then, of course, you can see here the distribution of the respondents by ethno-racial self-identification. So the mestizos, of course, were the biggest group, Montuvios, and then Afrodescendants, indigenous people, and whites, and others. The others, we could talk about all of that, but I don't think. So of these, because we have a lot of data, we collected a lot of data with the survey, but 70% declared having knowledge of these instruments. Okay, we very much believe that the no response should be added to the no knowledge, most probably. And so that's how we analyze it. So 70%. You will see in a moment then the percentage of those who know these instruments diminishes when we reach the level of the ethno-racial law that has to do with anti-discrimination. then the operators know less about anti-discrimination law than they know about collective rights. And this is something that I forgot to say, you see in the law schools. The law schools, these courses that I was talking about in the second facet, is most of the courses have to do with collective rights. And which is, as a matter of fact, an expression of, in our analysis of these results, an expression of this primacy of law indígena. Because of course, you know, we know of the work of so many people. What's the name of Judith? That there is in social science literature about ethnoracial minorities, that there is a association, almost natural association of indigenous people with collective rights and of Afrodescendants with anti-discrimination. What Afrodescendants need to be happy is anti-discrimination, but the other ones, because of the vision, you know, there is a here we're dealing with the way the elites look at law indígena and identify it particularly as a rural phenomenon, while and not so much as an urban, while the urban indigenous population has been growing exponentially these past few years. But and so there is still this view. So so that's what I'm saying. I'm just. Yeah, so what are the Constitution? What are those who know about these instruments of collective rights? What are the instruments? And of course, the Constitution is the first instrument by far. And the other ones are the law on national equality councils. So all of those laws were adopted after the 2008 Constitution. Okay, so they are all, they are part of what we could call the universe of the 2008 Constitution. So those who say that they have experience, of course, with such cases that involve collective rights, and you see that basically 56% of the judges and so on. So basically 67% of the respondents say that they don't have experience, 33 that they do have experience with those cases. When we look in the details of this, you will see that those who have experience with that are mostly indigenous lawyers who are based in the El Oriente. So the Oriente is the Amazonian region. So you have Ecuador, just like Peru, and Colombia as well. It's a bit different in Colombia. There are three big regions: La Costa, La Sierra, El Oriente, or the Amazonian region. And so many of these, most of the attorneys and operators in general are based in the Oriente. And so, and then we also asked them, what do you think the ethnoracial legal instruments are useful for? What population are these instruments useful for? And so then they could answer more than one group at a time. So some say the indigenous and Afrodescendants, for instance. This is why we reach a different total here, you know. But again, those who are ethnoracial law for collective rights is mostly beneficial, the respondent said, for indigenous people, and later on for these other categories. So, so anti-discrimination, the second category, and you can see, oh, it moved a little bit. I'm sorry about that. Oh, it went there. So sorry about that. But you can see here that those who have knowledge are a little lower than in the previous case, in the previous categories. And this is about the auto-identification. I'm sorry about that. So yes, so 78% say that they have So what are the instruments, the legal instruments? And here, the penal code. El Código Integral Penal has several articles that criminalize discrimination and hate, racial hate. So, and all of these other instruments that you must have. Organic law of communication is a particularly Ecuadorian instrument, and I wrote about it. It's mostly regulating anti-discrimination in the press, in the media. And here you see that, you know, they 65% say that they don't have experience with such cases, and only 11% have experiences. You remember it was, that percentage was higher for the other category of ethnoracial legal instruments. Very important. They're very important, and that's it. So I'll be glad to answer the questions that you have about the facet. So now I want to go to the fourth facet, and as I explained, we focused on 13 litigations that unfolded since after 2008. And I would like to show you a few minutes of a video about one of these litigations, and which is still ongoing. It's supposed to be passed in front of the Constitutional Court in the next few weeks. And if the innocence of the policeman who has shot a young black man in the back of the head continues to be declared as innocent, then the lawyers and the organizations around the family of the complainants will then move the case to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, with the hope that they will then recommend the case to the court, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So, and so, of these 13 cases, of these 13 litigations, what we are doing mostly is we are applying that concept of race regulation customary law that was coined by Tania Hernandez. Tania Hernandez is a law scholar who has published on race and the law in Latin America, and she's based at Fordham University. And she's a member, a co-founding member of Ojalá. She and with me and a few other people. And so she coined this concept of race regulation customary law, about which I would like to give you some explanation, because, of course, when I talk, let's just prepare this here. And so when Tania Hernandez talks about race regulation customary law, she's not thinking about what anthropologists have been referring to when they use the expression customary law, which is usually a body of laws and practices that have not been written down and that exists in some sort of a oral tradition, and it's usually referred to associated with populations, global South population, indigenous population, and so on. So she's not at all referring to that. When she's referring to, when she's using the concept of race regulation customary law, she's referring to the habit and the customs, the dispositions, the sentiments that the operators of the justice system have, and that when they intervene, not only the operators of the justice system, but also civil society in general, and how members of civil society intervene eventually in the judicial processes to limit, in favor of the reproduction of the racial status quo, the status quo in race relation, instead of, and limit the impact of these instruments that were, as I was saying, adopted in order to change the present, in order to reach a future which will be the utopian future, a perfect society, and so on. And so we are now, Tania Hernandez, when she coined the race regulation customary law, it was an abstraction. She didn't really apply. We want to look at the 13 cases and be able to pinpoint exactly where. So that's what I'm going to do in the short video that we're going to see the first few minutes, and I'll be able to point to you before we begin talking where we see race regulation customary law appear. So I think his name was Claudio or Marcet.
Ready for the video?
Yes. So it's one case, one of the 13 cases. And I invite you to go to ojalá.fiu.edu. You click on the button, Ojalá NSF, and there the video is there. So you can see the entire video in your own time.
This is the case that you mentioned earlier?
Yes.
Man,
Yes. Yes.
Can you let him know?
Go ahead. We can begin the projection. We don't see it. Yeah, but we don't see it.
Eres mi amor, eres mi razón. Yo no me acostumbro a estar sin ti.
En un rincón de la provincia de Imbabura, en Ecuador, una historia de dolor y lucha por justicia emerge. Esta es la historia de Andrés Martín Padilla Delgado, un joven afrodescendiente cuya vida fue brutalmente interrumpida. Este video ambiciona presentar los hechos que terminaron con la vida del joven afroecuatoriano Andrés Padilla el 23 de agosto del 2018 a manos del policía David Velastegui, miembro del Grupo de Operaciones Especiales GOE. En medio de un incidente registrado en el control policial de Mascarilla, ubicado en la provincia de Imbabura, a 30 minutos de la ciudad de Ibarra, al norte de Ecuador. La muerte de Andrés fue causada por un disparo en la cabeza que le alcanzó cuando se encontraba de espaldas al policía. Más allá de los hechos, el video quiere presentar las varias etapas del litigio que la familia del joven Padilla empezó en contra de David Velastegui y de la Policía Nacional. El 23 de agosto de 2018, en Salinas de Ibarra, Ecuador, ocurrió un accidente de tránsito entre dos autos. Uno de ellos, una camioneta manejada por un afroecuatoriano. Los policías que llegaron al lugar ordenaron el traslado de los vehículos en grúas hacia Ibarra, ya que los choferes no llegaron a un acuerdo. Preocupados por perder su medio de subsistencia, los afrodescendientes en la camioneta impidieron que ésta fuera llevada, lo que provocó un operativo de persecución policial hacia el control integrado de Mascarilla.
Cuando ocurrió este hecho, se lo estaba tildando al señor Padilla, que fue la persona que lastimosamente perdió la vida en este incidente, de que se estaban robando una wincha, ¿sí? Cuando el señor Padilla jamás tuvo participación en ese evento. Se decía que era un grupo que estaba impidiendo que se realicen las labores policiales porque estaban traficando con la minería.
Jacqueline Delgado, madre de Andrés Padilla, explica que su hijo viajaba de El Juncal hacia la ciudad de Ibarra para reparar su camioneta, la cual utilizaba para vender frutas y verduras. Al llegar al lugar del incidente, Andrés se unió a las protestas para evitar el traslado de la camioneta accidentada. Si bien Andrés estuvo presente en el conflicto, no estaba armado, no participó de la toma de la grúa y no comprometió la vida de ningún agente policial.
Si la camioneta del accidente estuvo con minería, tenía que haberle cogido los del GOE. Fue un simple accidente de tránsito que nada tuvo que ver. Inclusive pueden sacarle al señor de la grúa, que según ellos dijeron que mi hijo le había venido robando, que le había quitado.
Además, él no tenía relación con las personas involucradas en el conflicto generado en el control de mascarilla. Luego de la presentación de los hechos, de las intervenciones de los abogados de las dos partes, de la fiscalía y del testimonio del padre de la víctima, quien aludió que su hijo fue matado por un disparo en la espalda, el juez impuso la medida cautelar de prisión preventiva a David Velastegui, acusado de homicidio, durante los 30 días de instrucción fiscal.
Que el fiscal es el único culpable para que esto no se haya llevado a juicio extrajudicial. Porque el fiscal no se dio de cuenta la magnitud del problema que suscitó. Mi hijo, ¿qué es lo que hace? Se da la vuelta y sigue caminando, o sea, evitándole. Él es el que comete la estupidez, la ignorancia de desenfundar el arma y disparar por la espalda.
Hay que recordar que el caso de Andrés Padilla inició como homicidio, sin embargo, este tuvo una variación con el artículo 293 en el que se hace alusión a la extralimitación en un acto de servicio. Este delito fue considerado por Fiscalía necesario por ser David Velastegui, un policía que estaba a cargo en servicio activo, se podría decir, y que mató a una persona civil totalmente indefensa.
Un mes después de la primera audiencia, es decir, el 24 de septiembre, el juez amplió el plazo de instrucción fiscal por 30 días más, reformulando cargos a David Velastegui por extralimitación en un acto de servicio, lo cual se refiere al artículo 293 del Código Orgánico Integral Penal, COIP. Esta decisión del juez se tomó a pesar de la solicitud del abogado de Velastegui, quien pidió que se impusieran medidas alternativas, debido a la peligrosidad de mantenerlo en prisión, considerando que Velastegui es policía y ha colaborado con la justicia, además de no haber intentado fugarse.
Nuestros temores principales son que realmente el asunto político desde el Ministerio del Interior no haya persuadido a ningún miembro del tribunal para que la justicia se pueda dar pronta, eficaz y sin parcializaciones.
El 4 de enero de 2019 se dictó el auto de llamamiento a juicio. David Velastegui fue señalado como autor directo del delito, manteniendo la prisión preventiva. La búsqueda de la verdad continuaba.
La primera sentencia tiene conocimiento el tribunal de la ciudad de Ibarra, el mismo que a través de 2 votos toma la decisión de declarar culpable a David Velastegui a 3 años y 4 meses de pena privativa de libertad, con una multa de 10 salarios básicos unificados del trabajador, sin considerar la reparación a las víctimas, en este caso la señora Argentina Delgado, quien es la víctima indirecta de todo esto.
El 28 de agosto de 2019, al concluir esta audiencia de juicio penal, el tribunal dictó su resolución reduciendo la pena de Velastegui por su cooperación con el sistema judicial. Durante la audiencia, la defensa de Velastegui alegó que el policía actuó conforme a la ley.
En la sala de apelación y en la sala de casación han visto irrisorio poder tomar en consideración este particular y solo han tomado 2 cosas: tipicidad y antijuricidad. Y la antijuricidad vista desde el punto de que él estaba en el cumplimiento de un deber legítimo y legal como miembro de la Policía Nacional. Es decir, no importa si disparó o no disparó, si mató o no mató, sino que él estaba en el deber y el cumplimiento de sus obligaciones como Policía Nacional.
El representante de la familia Padilla replicó: el disparo fue por la espalda. No hubo confrontación, solo ocurrió un abuso de poder.
Tenía su cinto con todos los elementos, incluyendo un gas lacrimógeno, el cual nunca lo utilizó. Y es más, recordemos el caso, el señor policía le disparó por la espalda a un hombre que se encontraba desarmado. Le disparó por la espalda a una distancia aproximada de 5 metros. No había necesidad de ese disparo. Es más, se indicó que por último, si hizo uso del arma de dotación policial, podría haber disparado en partes no vitales. Pero este disparo fue directo a la cabeza y hay que tomar en cuenta que el señor miembro policial es instructor de tiro, era francotirador. Él sabía dónde disparar y efectivamente le dio un certero disparo por la espalda a la altura de la cabeza.
La intervención del gobierno se evidenció en las declaraciones del presidente Lenín Moreno y de la ministra María Paula Romo, quienes apoyaron al policía David Velastegui.
Sepan ustedes, señor comandante general, señora ministra del Interior, sean ustedes los portavoces a todos los policías en la patria. Indicarles que tienen todo nuestro respaldo, así como lo estamos haciendo. Por dar un ejemplo, en el caso de Mascarilla, nos hemos encargado de la Procuraduría Jurídica del señor policía.
Cuando este automóvil se pone sobre la grúa le ayuda a huir a la camioneta que estaba cargada de material minero. La grúa empieza y se dirige hacia la zona del control de Mascarilla y en esta zona lo que hacen es todo un operativo para evadir el control de Mascarilla,
generando preocupación sobre la independencia e imparcialidad judicial.
Es vital recordar este caso, denominado Mascarilla, que comenzó hace 5 años, cuando ya van a ver las imágenes. Una serie de miembros del crimen organizado estaban protegiendo una camioneta que ya van a ver lo que llevaba, alada por una grúa o protegida por una grúa en un control policial denominado así, Mascarilla, en el Chota, Imbabura.
La audiencia de apelación del 24 de diciembre de 2019 fue el escenario de un nuevo giro en el
Thank you. So a few words to finish before I tell is that you can see the eruption of what Tania Hernandez calls race regulation customary law with the behavior of the police officers, for instance, and some audiences who have been very violent with the Padilla family and their relatives, and who went to attend the audience, but also in the intervention of the president, the Minister of the Interior, la Ministra de Gobierno, and of course the whole narrative that is deployed in part by that journalist that you see at the end, but also by the ministra, la ministra, which presents, in fact, una turba de negros delincuentes que, ¿no es cierto?, que atacaron al policía y el policía tuvo que defenderse. Entonces, and this is something that it's a narrative that has developed. At some point, they even alluded that Andrés Padilla, la víctima, was a delinquent. He had been arrested before and so on. So, but of course, there was nothing to that effect. So there are really specific moments. In this case, in particular, they change. Okay, Velastegui was declared guilty. He was sent to prison because of a rule of engagement, un reglamento, como se dice, a regulation of the national police for the use of force. And that was redacted in a particular way, which justified his condemnation. they changed that regulation after the fact to allow, if you continue the film, you will see that, to allow a judge to later on declare the police officer innocent. So, race regulation, customary law, it's a very concrete thing that you can eventually put your finger on when you go through these 13 cases. So thank you very much, and sorry to be long.
Well, that's a very interesting comment, Jean, because one of the fundamental aspects of rule of law is you're not supposed to be judged by a law that didn't exist when the alleged crime took place. So, but we're now going to have comments. Professor Andrea Quealy first.
Hey, oh my goodness. So thank you, Jean, for this incredibly important work. And it's really just kind of pulling that curtain back, right, to look at how it is that anti-Blackness is reproduced, so I'm glad you ended with that clip, because I wanted to start my comments with this question about protection. And so with that second facet of the ethnoracial laws around protections against discrimination. So, so the saga of the legal battle, that's documented in the film, is that protection? Like, I have this question about if, what would have happened had that law not been in place, right? What is it that we're comparing this to? And so, because clearly this is about the fact, the work shows that these laws do not, affect the day-to-day lives. They don't protect Afro-Ecuadorians, right? And so I'm just curious about that idea of what protection looks like. And within this context of, this particular way in which Black people are assaulted in Ecuador. So that's one of the, I don't know if you wanted me to go on and discuss or kind of make my comments and then you can respond, or do you want to have a conversation? Okay. So that was one of the thoughts that I had about particularly about this film. And the other has to do with the title of the film, right? So, do Afro-Ecuadorian lives matter? So it's obviously a part of the global Black Lives Matter movement and influenced by that. And I'm wondering what the kind of language around the resistance to police brutality was prior to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm wondering if you could historicize this a bit to say, well, how, and I guess this relates to the question of protection, right? So how is it that people, what recourse did people have in terms of the resisting these assaults, right? Resisting this, lack of justice. And then another dimension, which the film also brings forth, not so much in the clip that you showed, but is the economic element, right? So the compensation for victims, this idea of reparations. How do you see, or how do the findings at all speak to the economic motivations, right, behind the maintenance of the status quo? So in other words, if Andres Bahia's mother and family is compensated for that loss of income, right, because I didn't realize that he was a promising soccer, an athlete, but also just she talks about this, that I don't have this income. And what he was doing when he got shot, bringing home money for his family, right? So I'm wondering about that too. Like, is there kind of an economic dimension that's brought into the cases and that is foregrounded at all? And is part of the discourse around resisting the implementation of the law about the economic the impact on probably elite and not so elite actors, right? What does it mean to repair, to compensate, right? So those are the questions that I had about the film, or that were particularly brought out by the film. The other thing that kind of kept coming to me as I was thinking about your work is the archive and this history of Afro-descendants and their presence in the historical historical narratives through their presence in court cases, right? So I kept thinking like, oh, okay, is this a different iteration of the work that Afro-descendants did in the pre-emancipation period, going into relying on the law like as a mechanism for justice, right? Within the constraints in which they experience themselves. So I was just also wondering about how is this part of that legacy? Is there a way that shows up in the narratives, and also just I don't know, just in any way does that show up? Because I feel like there is this continuity there. There's this continuity of the way that Afro-descendants have contested their particular circumstances and used the legal system to contest their particular circumstances. And so, so that was one thing that I also wanted to, you to speak about if that resonates at all. And then the other, I know that's what I said. I have lots of comments. So the other piece is I don't know how many people have ever seen the movie with Judi Dench and Cate Blanchett, Notes on a Scandal, and there's this line where she says, "Mind the gap between life as it is and life as you imagined it would be," right? And so I feel like there's this huge gap that has been persistent from raceless nationalism prior to the multicultural term. This gap between the lived experiences of Afro-descendants and then what it is that the national discourse projects, right? And so, is this another? This strikes me as another iteration of it, right? Another manifestation of that distance. And so do you see your work as trying to illuminate that distance, right? And is there, or I should ask you, what are the potentials for the work, which I hope goes beyond, I know Ojalá is going to be going beyond the NSF grant, right? But how it is that the work can make an intervention into, right? Perhaps close the gap a bit between what it is the constitutionalists imagined society could be and what is the realities, the day-to-day, on the ground realities. And then, I'll end my comments with another question, and that has to do. One of the things that's so fascinating about the work is, the survey and the interviewing of the law students, right, and looking at how it is that the laws are taught. And so, if they're not taught in law schools, then the people don't practice it, and then there's people don't have lawyers that are skilled that can actually try these cases. So, was there any? I don't know, from the interviews, a sense of why it is. Who is responsible for the choices in the curriculum, and what would it look like to have this be included in the curriculum, right? Like, what would that entail? What would be necessary? So, so I'll stop there, and I don't know if you want me to turn it on.
Sean, it's okay. We get Manuel's
Yes.
comments, and then you can take it together.
Sure.
Okay, I'll be brief. Well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate you and your team for such a piece of significant research with a pioneering focus. I think you've engaged in the first systematic examination of how ethnoracial laws are applied, or what happens to those laws after they exist for Afro-descendants in the South American judicial system. You say some of that. There are some other projects that have looked tangentially, and I was trying to because I've followed some of what they've done. There's one called ILEX, led by Afro-Colombian lawyers. I think you mentioned that in your report. There is a Race and Equality Institute that has some projects that focuses on Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, focuses on studying and systematizing the application of laws to Afro-descendants. There's that Lahore Latin American Justice and Race Observatory out of USP in São Paulo, Brazil, that had taken I think the closest approach to you on law in action. That project, Etnicidad y Derecho en Brasil y Colombia, which is a comparative project, and there is an observatory of racial discrimination in Peru out of the Pontifical Catholic University, and they all cover some areas that you cover, and you know, the only reason why I mention those projects is because I think what you've achieved is unique in the sense that you highlighted something that none of those projects have highlighted, which is you know, you compare the distinction between this focus on indigenous and you know, which is different from the focus on Afrodescendants. There is a logical reason for that, which is that there are more indigenous peoples, including in Ecuador. In fact, in Ecuador, according to the last census, Afro-Ecuadorians went from 7.2% of the population to 4.8% of the population. The largest, you know, the indigenous people are about 7%. Obviously, this is self-declared. There are studies that have focused on that, on what's happening to Afro-Ecuadorians. You know, is because they're less, or because now people do not identify themselves as Afro-Ecuadorians, and why is that? And what happens to that 70-some% of the population that identifies themselves as mestizo, mixed race? What percentage do they have that might help the Afro-Ecuadorian cause? Obviously, these are you know, highly speculative issues, but I think that precisely if it's true that there are less Afro-Ecuadorians or less people identifying themselves as Afro-Ecuadorians, I think that makes it even more important to study Afro-Ecuadorians and ethno-racial laws addressing Afro-Ecuadorians. Seems counterintuitive, but if it's an even smaller minority, if you look at you know, language related projects, laws that protect language and other cultural manifestations, you know, they become more critical and more important when language is about to be extinct. And I'm not suggesting that there's a comparison here, but I think that if there are less people in that category, you know, your project or the problems that you're addressing become even more important. So I think that's something that obviously you would probably agree with, but I would like to hear your comments about that. There are two things that struck me, and I'll end with this, and they, you know, there are questions coming out of those. The first one, well, it doesn't surprise me that law schools don't have almost anything. That there's one symbolic law school, the flagship, that has a vast number of courses addressing, you know, labeled as courses addressing this. There is a law school in Mexico, and there is an institute in Mexico called SEAD that about 10 years ago engaged, and this was again indigenous, not Afro-Mexicans, that focused on indigenous legal education for indigenous peoples, and they focused on a law school in the south of Mexico that is all indigenous. And interestingly, their observation was that's not what we want. You know, what we want is that every law school has a meaningful number, not just that you have the one that you can show in studies or in documentaries and say, oh, look, you know, there are all the colors here. So I'm curious about two things. In that law school, and obviously this is not what you were focused on, but that law school that has everything ethno-racial, how do the traditional courses look like constitutional law, for example? Or are the other courses permeated by this ethno-racial approach? And conversely, and probably more important, because it would also show the reach of this ethno-racial type regulation, whether in the traditional law schools, especially those that have almost nothing or nothing, whether the ethno-racial regulation appears in the traditional courses. that's a question I have, because it strikes me that, the constitutional reform of Ecuador of 2008 was so important that even non-Ecuadorian law schools in other Latin American countries, and even South African law schools, and even some law schools in the United States would have courses that would focus on some of these rights. Of course, the American versions were like very distant. Yeah, the text. Okay, that's law in the books, not necessarily in action. So that's that. And then finally, I think focusing on specific litigation and these disputes, it's very important. It shows you how law lives or doesn't live. But I wonder if there are cases outside the mainstream, the main the cases that doesn't necessarily focus on ethnoracial or the application of ethnoracial laws that are important to Afrodescendants. I would imagine, family law cases, involving custody and so on, labor, obviously, and environmental. The Constitution of Ecuador was so broad and so deep that it covered all these different categories from specific groups of people. Anyway, I will stop here because it's very tempting to continue talking. But thank you, and I'm fortunate to be here, and I hope there are many, many more events like this and grateful to LAC for doing this.
Thank you. So I should perhaps engage with that before I'm going to try to do that very quickly. But the thing that one has to keep in mind is that for us to have 13 emblematic litigations means that many other complaints died off and never made it to court. Why? Because of the behaviors of judges or of prosecutors who might have, and most certainly have indeed, it's documented, killed the case before, dismissed the case before it, and as an important to be dealt with in a practice. So this is something that one has to really, there are more cases, for 13 cases to make it, you probably have 3 times that case, that number, or at least two times that number. You have to keep in mind that all the 13 cases that we have seen have results that are unsatisfactory, judged as unsatisfactory be them about derechos colectivos or anti-racial law, anti-discrimination. And why? Because the decisions of the judge eventually are not respected and are dismissed. For instance, there is a case of Michael Arce, who was a cadet in a military school, and the instructor who was found guilty, he went to prison as well, and he was supposed to do a public apology. He did an apology which was not an apology, and so on and so forth. So the application of the laws, of all of these laws, are judged completely unsatisfactory by the people who have been complaining and who are who have initiated these cases. So the question of compensation really is, it's an environment that is not propitious at all to produce reparation. There is no result. There is no action that could be identified as a reparatory, and so that's what I say here. The objectives of Ojalá, of course, Ojalá wants to document. We want to observe the practice of the judicial system in order to complain about it, in order to make their limitations visible and accessible for everyone to see. and with the hope that that will eventually go in the direction of improving, the systems and eventually, make the work of those who want to eventually make additional reforms, because we don't, we want to observe and publicize. One objective of Ojalá is to eventually, every so many years, produce a report, just like you have on the entire region and what has been happening during that period with ethnoracial law, for instance, and with Afrodescendant rights, either collective rights or the rights to live free from discrimination. So, the Universidad Amautawasi is a marginal university. So it's a university where you have very few students. The biggest university, la Universidad Central or la Universidad de Guayaquil, were the two big ones where you have the most graduates coming out, have one or two courses. So now, of course, I could go on to talk about the methodology. How did we identify these courses? So we interviewed constitutional law professors, and as well as students who have, before we did, and before we selected the list, in order to select the courses, said, no, we don't talk constitutional law. To think that, one would think that a course on constitutional law for an undergraduate student in law, because of course you have to think that in Latin America you get an undergraduate degree in law. Los abogados no tienen doctorado. So and they say no, they don't talk about that. They're going to talk about a whole bunch of things that are in the Constitution, because of course the Constitution is a vast document, but there is a very little. And so that is why we followed our selection of the courses is the product of conversations we have had with both law professors and students. Yes.
So in the conversations, did they explain why? Was this, no, we don't include that? Was there just?
No, but the students, we had more conversation about that with the students. The students eventually, but also with professors but the students usually say, we would like to have more. We wish they would cover more. Even those who are not Afro-descendant law students, they say we should have more, particularly also the operators, who, because we had focus group with operators as well, separately from the focus groups with the students. And we had a focus group with the operators following the workshop that we gave them. And then we observed them during the workshop, because we asked the instructors to make them speak. And then we selected them and invited them for the workshop, for the focus group, for the focus group. So ELEX, in fact, gave us one of the instructors. One of the instructors is the director of ELEX. So we are very much in contact with ELEX, and she was in charge of one of one of the modules of the workshop. The module, the workshop had 4 days, and so she was in charge of one day, the last day. So so I'm sure that I know that many people have talked about the text of the Ecuadorian Constitution of 2008, as well as the Bolivian ones, which are looked at as being the most progressive, and so on and so forth. But this is, of course, law in the books, because which is one thing that is completely distinct from law in action. But I don't know if it's something. I don't know. We could open up. Somebody wants to say something.
So let me I have a question about the history, right? So in other words, how you situate this in the context of the broader arc of the Afro-Ecuadorian experience, you know, and so because you've been, you know, going to Ecuador and you have, those are your people, right? So how does it show up in people's everyday lives and experiences?
Okay, so that's something that I wanted to say as well, is that there is a particularly in the, because we had also a focus group with Afrodescendant attorneys and operators all together, all Afrodescendants. And everyone was basically very frustrated, very disappointed because they were there at the moment when there was this constitutional assembly and SOS un nuevo estado, etc. Everybody was happy, you know, Rafael Correa, etc. And then, but they now know very well that without political will, the application, without the right political will, the application of these instruments will go nowhere, will have no results. What you need, the adoption of these instruments by themselves is one thing, but it's very little thing. What you need is really a will to really try to use these instruments in order to reach that utopian future that you know, the legislators were thinking about when they designed these instruments. And so this is their view, is that there is some sort of a disillusioned gaze on all of that, and a conclusion that they are convinced that without political will, nothing is going to happen. So now another thing that I wanted to say on the census, there is also the methodology of the census. You cannot take the census. So the last census has provoked a major uproar among Afro-descendants in Ecuador, because their numbers indeed has diminished, and so they're talking about the ethnocide. You know, some activists are talking about that, because this is a way to facilitate the dismissal of their demands. You know, and so there are census takers have a hand in the results. That, so what appears as self-identification might not be truly self-identification. For instance, there are census takers who were informed that if an indigenous person, for instance, because the number of indigenous also diminished between the last one and the previous one. So if an indigenous person speaks Spanish, you shouldn't put as an indigenous. So, or you should. So the census takers have some agency in the results of the census. So one has to look at these census, not look at these census as if they were a true mirror of what's going on in the reality. And so, on the contrary, one should think about. Particularly when you think about the greater visibility of Afro-descendants, is that in urban areas and so on, is that what happened? You know, that's and many of them are, in fact, have engaged. There are some people that have begun publishing about that.
But even if it's smaller, which is what I said at the end, so if it's shrinking, if the group is smaller, it would be easier to fix things for them. Yep. Because you have less people to worry about.
No, but
it would be cheaper.
But that's not the case. Yeah. So.
Well, one would imagine, right?
Yeah.
They only have a handful, then you know they're right by that.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
It's a follow-up question to what you call constitutional utopianism, which is very prevalent in Latin America. I think you see it all the time.
But that's the new constitutionalism. That's a characteristic of new.
Yeah, it's very aspirational. But and you were implying in your most recent comment about it that it's pernicious because it leads to disillusionment. It leads to delegitimization of the constitutional document because people realize that it's got no connection to reality. And I think there's a book by Bruce Ackerman called The Future of the Liberal Revolution, where he advocates, this was at the time of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, and he's telling these constitutional makers, be very minimalist in what you do in the Constitution. Make sure that what you approve in the Constitution is enforceable, because if not, you're going to delegitimize the document. however, I think there is another argument in favor of constitutional utopianism in the sense that at least it creates an aspiration. At least it sets a goal. And you know, the fact that it can't immediately be enforced may not be, you know, a total, it may not be fatal, because what you could be doing is provoking people into saying, let's close the gap. It's there, the aspirational document is there, and so we can mobilize and try to enforce. And then in the history of many constitutions, that's what actually happens, right? You could argue that it happens in the United States over a long period of time. So I want to push you on constitutional utopianism. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe the fact that people are getting disillusioned could be the first step towards them mobilizing and trying to close the gap. And if it didn't exist, if you haven't had those people in the Constitutional Assembly saying, okay, let's, the Brazilians do all this the time. They had protests in 2013. They said, the Congress said, let's pass a constitutional amendment giving people the right to mobility in their own city. And it was like, it's kind of totally meaningless when it was first passed. I mean, what does that mean? But what they were trying to address is this idea that the prices are too high on public transportation, that they're forced farther and farther out because of the cost of living. And maybe some crazy movement leader can seize on that and push things in a direction that's positive. It's never going to reach the utopian level of the assembly. So how do you weigh that up?
Yeah, but the balance
between being having a constitution that's enforceable,
yeah,
realistic, and that's gains legitimacy because it's real.
Yeah,
one that's clearly aspirational, clearly out of tune with the actual society, but possibly a vehicle for change.
Yeah, my thinking about Latin American constitutions is as an anthropologist, not as a scholar or not as a legal scholar or a political scientist either, but in the sense that I'm mostly looking at this constitution as the expression of what has been, as someone who is interested in studying multiculturalism, and here as an ideology, as a modus operandi of the state, and of its supposedly judicial system. But the thing is that nobody can negate the fact that these new constitutions and the flurry of the multiple rights that these constitutions come with for women, for youth, for older people, for fragile people, for ethnoracial minorities, and so on. And one cannot say, yes, of course, it doesn't work like the legislator, but did a few things change? Of course. Or what was happening before? To just think about the fact that you do have now in Ecuador a constitution that acknowledges in one of its first articles the existence of Afrodescendants. It's a revolution. Previous constitution didn't mention anything. And then, of course, we have to think about the fact that the elites, Latin American elites, and particularly in the Andes, but in other places as well, are themselves very much linked to, in a particular way, to indigenous population and through mestizaje. Blanqueamiento, mestizaje, and so the mestizo, white mestizo elites see themselves, even in perhaps a racist fashion, but see themselves connected to indigenous people in a way that they are absolutely never connected to Afrodescendants. So in a way, in the ideology of mestizaje, which reifies mestizaje as a prototypical national identity, indigeneity is included, even though it has to be whitened and improved in a way, but not the Afrodescendants. Afrodescendants are not part. So mestizaje in the Andean region has nothing to do with the mestizaje in Cuba, where you do have their race mixing, which the understanding of mestizaje in Cuba might eventually include Afrodescendants. And in mestizo in Portugal, in Portuguese, in Brazil as well. It's a race mixing that can eventually, it's free from ingredients, from biological ingredients. In the Andean region, mestizaje no es mulataje. Oh, yeah, it's different from Brazil, it's different from Cuba. But un mestizo es indio y europeo. Entonces, so this is why in Mexico, for instance, they talk about we have to acknowledge our third root, and this is why they talk about Afro-mestizos, which is a acknowledgement of the fact that mestizos do not include Afros.
Sounds redundant, but it's not if you appreciate that.
In that way. El mestizaje of José Vasconcelos, no, it's a mestizaje between white and indigenous people. That's not, so this is part of the difficulty when we talk about, we use terms in different languages. Métissage in French is also open to any biological ingredient. It's not linked to, in Spanish, so you may not, this is a point I've always made, you may not translate mestizaje in Spanish to métissage in French. Simply like that. If you do, then you have to add footnotes and a series of different things. But anyway, so, and this is part of the fact that there is a primacy of law indígena is because of that connection, of that integration of law indígena within the national identity and the ideology of mestizaje as a national identity. Yeah. So, but
John, I think we probably have to wrap it up. I mean, we could go on a lot longer.
Yes.
Thank you. But we have to because of the time constraint.
Yes.
But I want to thank you for presenting the research.
My pleasure.
And, I'm very much looking forward to the book as well because
oh yes,
that could be another event, another LAC event.
Oh yeah.
On the diaspora book, and Andrea's book actually.
No, but first we will have the book on this project. Yeah.
So that's the immediate project.
Oh, that's the immediate. The other one is on hold until I finish that.
Oh,
I'm the main writer.
Let's do another one on
when the book comes out.
Based on this research. Yeah. Because so and thanks the thanks.
Thank you. Were there people?
Yes. You know, so that said,